Welcome to the second part of our conversation with Dr. Erim Gomez, Assistant Professor of Wildlife Biology at the University of Montana. In this episode, we delve into his experiences as a first-generation Mexican-American student turned conservationist. We talk about his influential mentors and how he, in turn, mentors underrepresented students, continuing to champion the little guy. If you haven't listened to part 1, I strongly urge you to go back and give it a listen. If you're ready to forge on to part 2, we'll jump right in.
We've read a lot of your previous interviews in our research. You've shared your experience, obviously, of not having faculty of color. How did that influence your decision to become a mentor and a role model for students from these underrepresented communities?
Yeah, I've had a lot of people help get me to where I am. Was asked to give a guest lecture on environmental education and recently, and about a week and a half before that lecture, I had already been asked months ago actually to do this. The first person I knew as a naturalist, and the first person I'd honestly say his whole job was as an environmental educator, Jim Hutchins, passed away at the age of 88. And he was the first one to introduce me to this idea of like the love of understanding the species, being able to meet the species that are around you and being able to describe the basic natural history around you. I've had a ton of great mentors. I've been very fortunate in that perspective. I've also realized looking back, I've had good mentors because I actively sought them out. And I had people that might have been advisors, literally, that weren't necessarily good mentors, or professors that didn't encourage me as much as other people did. What I've told all my mentors, Dr. Saylor, Dr. Parker, and Dr. D. Southard, Eric Dittmer, Professor Dittmer, Jim Hutchins, Mrs. Pinkston, all these people is that it literally, like, those are some of the fundamental people in my life, Norm Devereaux, Mr. Devereaux, that I'll try to pay it forward. I actually stayed in academia, or I finished my PhD because people. So when I was in graduate school, I was developing amphibian habitat models, so we can use for conservation. And while I do get excited about that, it's a very personal excitement and joy. But it wasn't as fulfilling to me as I wanted it to be, oddly enough, even though I'd been working at getting there for years. And within a short order, there a couple of students came into my life, and I was able to mentor them. And then I realized, oh, I can mentor I can do my research, and I can help students do their research. And I can still do this, the joy of that little kid that wanted to work with animals and study animals, right? Still fulfill that part in me, but have that greater sense of community, and giving back to that community. So everything that I do, and the reason that I ended up becoming a professor, was because of people. With my graduate students, my product isn't the research we reproduce. That's what we would call in structured decision making and wildlife management. That would be the means objective. It's getting us to where we really want to go, right? It's important because it gets us to where we want to go. And my goal is producing good scientists and good students, right? That is my fundamental goal. To get there, we have to train them up. We have to do good science. We have to publish good papers that have an influence on science or management. But my fundamental goal is the student. and producing a good manager and someone that is going to have an impact on conservation and management.
There's kind of a pay it forward in a sense. You learned from your mentors, you're giving that guidance back to your students. Do you have any advice for other people who are in your role where maybe it's not as fulfilling for them as they thought and they'd like to take on those mentorship capabilities? How can they make a positive impact in their communities?
Yeah, I always think there's opportunities to give back, whether that's mentoring, students, high school students, or younger professionals that are in your field, right? Whenever I meet, students, particularly students underrepresented in the field, I always tell them, if I can help you out in any way, let me know. I get joy out of doing that work. I get joy out of, uh, you know, seeing that growth and being able, pull people up along with me, because, I didn't have mentors of color, but I did have some great mentors, and I did seek and find them out, right? Some I was lucky to they appeared, and some I had to go and find them. And wherever people are, I tell this to my undergraduate students, sometimes they don't think they have a lot of power. I'm like, did you dream of being here in this seat at one point, right? And they're like, yeah. So when did you dream about that? And they're like, well, when I was in high school. I'm like, great, right? Look at that. There you go. You have the opportunity to mentor, right? Volunteering at the Natural History Museum on campus or off campus, right? Giving back to your community, whatever it is. For me, it's based around people. It doesn't have to be that for other people. Whatever giving back is for you, right? Find that sense of community that fulfills you. We all have talent, skills, and experience that others could use.
You've also been an advocate for more funding for the DEI programs, and actively tried to recruit more diversity into the STEM fields. Can you share a little bit about your success, and also maybe what more can be done for that?
When I think about why this field, in the conservation field specifically, why it isn't diverse. As it could be. It does not as diverse as the United States is. There's different reasons for that, right? Some of the reason, this is anecdotal, but would be that when people from lower socioeconomic status are actively are going to go to college, they're doing it to improve their socioeconomic status of themselves and their family, and or they're doing it to give back to their community. And so, I've seen in the Latino community, a lot of people go into psychology, a lot of people go into business, a lot of people go into the healthcare profession, right? Less so in engineering or conservation. Um, and part of that is because, in the Latino community is a really big deal, and it's really important. And so they want to use their degree to be able to change their community in some way, right? Or empower their community in some way. And that connection isn't always as straightforward in conservation, right? But I think diverse perspectives need to be in every room, right? From what kind of television shows are on Netflix, what's getting produced, to what music is on the radio, to what fashion says, to, recruiting practices for graduate and undergraduate programs. Wherever decisions are being made, there should, those rooms should look like the rest of the United States. Regardless of if that decision is affecting other people. And there has historically been barriers to entry into this field. Even just more broadly speaking, 25 plus years ago, 35 some years ago, if you were to, poll most wildlife biology students, they were coming from a harvest perspective, often they were interested in wildlife management because they, went and hunted. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like, that's great, right? There's also a lot of jobs in the field of harvest management, but it's not the only perspective, right? It's not the only, harvested animals aren't the only ones that matter, even ecologically, right? And so the ways that I think we can encourage people, right, is also just being, for me, it would be being who I am, right? I'm okay talking about my intersectionality, right? I'm okay about talking about having parents that were undocumented, at one point. I am comfortable speaking to how even growing up on a ranch the second half of my life affected me, right? I try to share my perspective with students. With trying to mentor students of color, I think this is actually doesn't just apply to student of colors. It applies to students that also may be coming from lower income households. One big barrier that we faced in the field, and one that I faced myself, was that oftentimes entry-level positions are volunteer positions, right? And I literally had that struggle when I was a student. Do I pay rent to get a job that pays rent, or do I volunteer at a job that does it? Well, I'd like the roof over my head. So, as much as I hated it, I ended up doing taking the job that paid the bills. One strategy that I tell my students to do is to look at tangentially related jobs in their field that get them working with that agency, right? Perhaps it's working at a boat check station, right? For the summer for the State Fish and Wildlife Agency. Maybe it's not their dream job isn't to work at a boat check station, but it might be to work with that agency. And so tell these students to be open to the opportunities that present themselves, and knowing that, that first job might not be working on wolves, right, in Yellowstone. It might be working in Yellowstone. As one of my guest speakers was, a security guard at Yellowstone, but he had to deal with nuisance bears at the time, and that eventually led to him working with bears, right? It's finding those opportunities for students and encouraging students to look at things that are pushing you in that right direction. And so often we think, okay, it has to be research, right? Or it has to be exactly doing this thing. It takes time to get there, right? And then there's ways to get there that you can still get paid while you're doing it. I do think more broadly, we still need to have a conversation of pay equity. I've had students, do some research on entry-level positions in the greater Northwest and Intermountain West. And, there's some places the average pay for seasonal jobs or internships is below minimum wage because some of them are internships, right? And pointing that out, that we need to balance the conservation work that we're doing with also creating opportunities for all people. And this isn't just, people, this hits across, diversity spectrums, right? This hits, people from lower socioeconomic status, regardless of their ethnic identity.
And that hits on a common theme that we've discussed with almost all of our podcast guests, which is there's a way to get to where you're going. There's multiple ways to get to where you want to be in life, and to the careers that you find yourself in. There is not just one path, and you can get there via many avenues.
In my class, I bring in 7 to 10 speakers, my freshman class, where I use this textbook. And every single one of them all of them have told me that their path was not direct, right? That it meandered, there's side channels, right? There's backtracking sometimes. Interestingly enough, a couple of the predator biologists, friends of mine, started working on small mammals or working on in marine environments on invertebrates, right? And it somehow led them, a couple of these people, it's funny because they didn't necessarily dream of being carnivore biologists, which is what a lot of my wildlife biology students want to be, right? But they got there in a roundabout way. And that wasn't even their end goal. Their end goal was, in a couple of these cases, was just to be a biologist.
This is a side note, but I actually saw a TikTok video the other day that was, it was a couple people talking, but they were making fun of their own, they called them their side quests. So if you've ever played video games, you know, you have side quests, and it was related, you know, similar to what we're talking about in terms of your career path and your life path, and that you might have some side quests that take you off into another direction, but you know, ultimately you still find yourself on the main quest.
And then sometimes those side quests give you skills or experiences or knowledge or
Absolutely.
connections that end up helping you in your ultimate goal or your fundamental goal.
Exactly. They almost always do. Yeah. So
I know this is probably going to be a huge question, but just for students who might be listening, what are some main careers that are available for someone getting a degree in wildlife biology or anything else in regards to conservation?
Yeah, there's different perspectives and ways to think about what levels and what influence you want to have. If you love working with endangered species, and you really enjoy behavior, and maybe you really enjoy education, well, maybe working at a zoo is for you, right? Where maybe you can study a little bit of behavior, maybe you do environmental education, you get to interact with the animals to a certain degree, right? You get to do some caretaking, right? That is one path. And then there's the path of just being a researcher, right? Where you're asking ecological questions, or biological questions, that might be working for the USGS. They hire research biologists, and they're kind of the in-house contracting arm for biologists for the federal government. For those type of permanent jobs, you probably need a PhD. For a career, if you want to have direct management and maybe interact with wildlife to some degree, but work on policy, what are we doing to conserve these species, or how are we managing harvest of these species? Working for state fish and wildlife agencies, natural resource agencies, they are the ones that do most of the wildlife management in the United States. It isn't the Forest Service or the National Park Service or even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's state fish and wildlife or natural resource agencies that do most of the on-the-ground management. That's because that's how we do management in the United States. That's not to say that you can't find examples of wildlife management in those other agencies. Specifically, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service they do the work, research, and management of threatened and endangered species, right? So once something becomes federally listed as threatened or endangered, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife comes in and can often take charge of the situation, right? And bring different collaborators, different partners, different agencies across state boundaries together to solve these problems. There is law enforcement, conservation law enforcement. The North American model works. North American wildlife management works because we have some level enforcement mechanisms, right? We try to reduce poaching. If we have laws, that typically has to be an enforcement mechanism with it. And, some people in that realm, they may go into conservation law enforcement, conservation officers. Some of them still get to do research and help as research technicians on projects, right? It means, helping with putting collars on, large mammals, or doing aerial surveys. Here in Montana, where I live, the game wardens do some of that work occasionally. Other states also do some of that work occasionally. And then there's advocacy work, right? Where you might be a nonprofit that fundraises for conservation on the ground or international conservation. But then there's conservation groups that advocate for policy change, right? So conservation is multidisciplinary. Are you interested in social media? Because most conservation organizations, public and private, federal and nonprofit, hire social media specialists, education specialists. Are you interested in law? Because there is, wildlife and environmental and conservation law as a profession, right? Are you interested in filmmaking, right? There's documentaries, there's art, right? And so I've had students that are double majoring in journalism, double majoring in public policy, double majoring. Oh, this is a great one. Double majoring in computer science, because the research side of things is moving to more and more quantitative, right? And so having that skill set, that student that's doing this is doing that because she really wants to, be on the cutting edge of research, and having those programming skills and computer skills and mathematical skills are going to be really useful for her career. This morning, I invited a speaker that works with conservation detection dogs. She uses dogs to find scats of species that they're trying to do research on. So you can use the dogs to find scats of animals that you want to do a diet study on, and you can tell a lot by the diet looking at the scat. Or you can use them to find cryptic species or hard to detect species, because dogs can smell through things that humans can't see, right? That was, there's always jobs. Whenever I look at wildlife job board pages, there's always jobs that are new to me. And I've been in this profession as a student or a professor or scientist for 24 years. And I'm always finding that there's new jobs out there. And they span from art to social science to science and engineering.
That really leads into the next question that we had as well. And, you just outlined a ton of positions that involve, physical hands-on field work, but there's also the data collection and data analysis and statistic side of things, including the computer science roles. And now that we have AI coming, I guess, into major headlines, at least, we'll have to see how it pans out for all of the different areas. What role do you see AI? Have you thought about AI? Have you looked into how AI could help with some of the statistical and data analysis sides of conservation, or even other aspects?
My PhD research was using machine learning algorithms to come up with occupancy models. It was one way to answer that question, or habitat models is the more broadly speaking. We call them in science, in my field, we call them occupancy models, but we're trying to model the habitat for species. AI is like any tool, right? What are you using it for, right? I think I'm not one of those professors that says, oh, don't use AI at all, right? Use it for what it's good for. I'm dyslexic. I totally use ChatGPT to go find any typos in my writing and point them out to me, and has double effect. Okay, first of all, it fixes, it fixes the typos, but it points them out to me, right? And then I'm like, oh, more aware of my mistakes, right? So I don't make them as often. I literally keep a notebook, like things that I mess up. I started doing this in graduate school, so I would like stop repeating the same mistakes. Something as simple as I often forget a preposition in a sentence for whatever reason. I think it, and it's sometimes I even read it, right, as if the preposition there when it's not even there. I think these are tools that we use, right? We can't overly rely on them. And there's obviously ethical considerations, but using it as a tool to improve your writing, not write it for you, right? Use it as a way, in science, maybe, asking questions that we don't always, we might not know the answers to, right? Coming up with potential hypothesis to test, to use this information. I think it's a tool. I think we're probably, as citizens and as professors, I think we'll get more out of it if we accept this is the reality we live in.
We do have one kind of overarching question that we'd like to ask, but before we do that, I'd like to make sure that we covered everything that you wanted to talk about today. Like I said, there's so much we could ask you, but we don't want to take up 3 hours of your day.
I would say find out what your why is, whatever that is for you, and that it might take a while to get there. Literally, I was in graduate school when I really figured out that like being a professor was my why, right? What my goal was, what fulfilled me, and being okay that it takes time to get there, right? That you don't have to know it at 18 years old. And I didn't come to the conclusion of what I want to do for a career till I was about 25. And then, even then I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a university professor. Not an easy thing to achieve, right? And so, try different things, find out what your passion is, know that even if you go to college for one thing, you might, do something else. I think one of the most useful things that I learned in college was how to teach myself. And, professors are kind of curators of knowledge and will share access to that and kind of try to put you in the right direction. But the students do the learning. Really, the teachers can't do the learning for the students, right? And so the teaching is one thing and the learning is a different thing. And so, take control of your own education, wherever that is, whatever route you go. And, find out what your purpose, what your why is. And so, my why, even my why being a professor, that why wasn't necessarily the education part. It was the community aspect of it, right? And the empowerment aspect for me.
That's a great message. And I think that ties very closely to what we usually ask at the end.
Yeah, this is a last little segment that we do in all of our interviews. It's called You're Wrong. Not you, but our listeners, maybe us. And this is your chance to set the record straight for, clear up any misconception in your field and let us know what we are wrong about. In the world of conservation or education. And you definitely have time to think about it.
I'll think about what surprises my students the most. When we're wildlife biology specifically, it really is wildlife biology and management. It's inherent, right? It's not just, it's not wildlife ecology or ecology, which is just looking to answer fundamental questions about how ecosystems work, how organisms interact with their environment, and vice versa. But wildlife biology specifically is about the management component, the conservation implications of that, right? There's a lot of obviously science to it. What we do in wildlife is actually manage people's actions, manage people, how they interact with resource extraction, manage harvest, manage when they can harvest, manage, what they can and cannot do on the landscape, right? And we do that based on values. So it's driven by what the communities that we work in, live in, states, the countries that we live in value, right? We know this, right? We spend more money on conservation on the wildlife that we value more, right or wrong, right? But that is part of the process. So if you're interested in a career of wildlife biology, just know that the field is about often managing people, right? And so you can get a degree in wildlife biology and only go the research route. And then people do that, right? But the vast majority of jobs actually is on the management side of things, where you're doing, at least the permanent jobs, where you're doing the, managing people.
That does lead me to another question, which is, for lay people like ourselves, what are ways that we can be better stewards of the environment?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot. And so there's, like everything, there's a two-prong answer. And so think of the impact that we're having, on the ecosystem, the organisms, right? From maybe not having a traditional lawn, but having native plants to attract native pollinators, right? Recycling is useful. I do it, right? But also consider, can you walk to your job, or can you bike to your job? Can you use public transit, right? To have a smaller effect on your ecological footprint. But then more broadly, are you showing up to state fish and wildlife, open houses where they're asking feedback on different management plans or projects? Are you supporting legislation or politicians, elected officials that have conservation as a key component of the things that they support, right? Individually, we can only kind of have so much effect. I think when we start thinking more broadly, the power of our vote, the power of volunteering in organizations that try to do conservation work and change policy, I think that's where we can have a big effect. One of the things that when I was an undergraduate student, that I heard and I've tried to employ, is this idea of think globally but act locally, right? We can have these daunting environmental problems, right? Climate change is supported with a bunch of evidence, right? The vast majority of climate scientists, right, support and accept the evidence for climate change and understand what's going on. And it can be hard to be like, well, what am I going to do about that, right? Well, what can you do in your communities? I worked when I was at Southern Oregon University as an undergraduate student. This is one of our questions, and I was co-advisor of a student-run environmental resource center. And what we did is me and my co-director, Laura Ross, set up a initiative, a ballot initiative for students, that they would have to pay $7 to $15 to offset the entire carbon usage of the university. And at the time we did this, we were the third university in the country to do this, right? It is still to this day probably the biggest effect I've had of anything I've ever done. And I did this as an undergraduate student. Sometimes I joke, I was like, I peaked too young, because my biggest thing was when I was younger. It was surprising how many, it only took 5 students to really do this work and pass and get the publicity and get this initiative passed. And it passed by 79%. Right? Like what passes, whatever passes with 79% approval.
I can't name anything off the bat. That's for sure. No, that's an excellent illustration. And I remember reading that in some of our research on your experience. And I thought, okay, it's interesting how powerful one or a couple of voices can be.
And it's so true, though, that when you're young, you have such passion for change. And it's kind of sad that it does dwindle as you get older. Because
I'm privileged enough, lucky enough that my life crossed paths with Dennis Hayes, the co-founder of Retake. He was on the Bullet Environmental Board that helped fund my PhD, and then later I served as literally yesterday was my last day as a trustee, and obviously having the privilege of connecting with someone that helped create Earth Day and led the first Earth Day and changed the idea from, it was originally going to be Earth Week and change it to Earth Day. It's the biggest non-religious holiday. I've asked them, what's kept you going over the years? It's been decades, and part of it, well, it's the right thing to do, right? It's the right thing to do. And so again, for him, I think that's environmental conservation and environmental sustainability is his why, right? And so finding that why is going to keep you driven.
The prevailing view that a species needs to provide value or tangible benefits in order to be considered worth saving is a conceited way of thinking. Who are we to decide which of Earth's creatures we should save from our own disastrous consequences? Just as charismatic minifauna are essential for thriving ecosystems, so too are minority and underrepresented communities for our society. While these systemic issues like diversity and inclusion and the conservation of species can seem daunting to tackle, we can all begin at home in our own communities. Thanks for tuning in to Can I Get a Retake, a podcast by Great River Learning. If you liked the episode, show your support by subscribing, sharing, and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. For detailed show notes and transcripts, visit greatriverlearning.com.
Can I Get a Retake is brought to you by hosts Michaela Albee and Michelle Manneman, with editing by Maggie Christensen. Artwork for the podcast is crafted by myself, and our intro music is courtesy of Comma Media. We'll be back soon with another captivating chat with a top GRL innovator.